So we're going to keep it really rapid fire as we talked about, and I wanted to ask you straight off. I mean, it really is a book that unpacks everything that you ever wanted to know about West Asia, and certainly about the problem that we are all sort of obsessed with in some ways, the Palestine-Israel problem. As we speak, there is another attempt at ceasefire, right? Biden is doing this, and before comes in, where do you see that going?
So apparently, the latest reports say that there is a chance for a ceasefire at this point of time. So we have to take this also with a bit of salt,
Yeah.
because the reason is that in the past there were repeated, reports that the ceasefire was within limits, but every time there was a possibility for a ceasefire. Even Hamas had said in the past that they were open for a ceasefire,
Yeah.
but the Israeli government pulled back. Prime Minister Netanyahu's government earlier said that they were open for a ceasefire, but then the Prime Minister will go on record saying that he would not accept a ceasefire unless he meets his objectives in Gaza. And his objectives in Gaza includes complete destruction of Hamas,
Yeah.
and the release of hostages, which he hasn't met even now, even after
Yeah.
13 months
Yeah.
of war. But now the possibility they are talking about is that Hamas apparently ceded on one of its key demands, which was that Israeli troops have to withdraw entirely from Gaza. But Hamas now says that Israeli troops can stay temporarily,
Yeah.
if there is a ceasefire, and in return for the hostage release. So that is a step ahead in reaching the ceasefire. But what we have to keep in mind is that even if there is a ceasefire, this is going to be a temporary one, because Israel doesn't have any plan to withdraw troops from Gaza. They already have presence in two corridors. One is
Yeah.
in the Rafah corridor, which is on the border with Egypt.
Yeah.
And then in northern Gaza, practically northern Gaza has been cut off from the rest of Gaza today. And northern Gaza, Israeli troops are treating that as a buffer zone.
Yeah.
Some 450,000 people are still staying there, and northern Gaza has been completely being destroyed. And no food aid is also, food and medicine are also not allowed in. So Israeli troops are certainly not going to leave northern Gaza. They are not going to leave the Philadelphia corridor on the Rafah border, which means even if there is a ceasefire, the conflict in Gaza, I'm not talking about the larger Palestinian conflict, which is definitely going to be there, but even the conflict in Gaza is not going to be resolved anytime soon.
So, can I, part of it is that there is going to be no Gaza. I mean, I think that if you look at right wing supporters in Israel, they believe that Gaza is already done. We've fixed that. And I wanted to talk to you really about. You start the book and you talk about going to West Bank, and that's really now where the next battle is going to start, right? Because they've finished Gaza and now we're going to go to the West Bank. Can you talk a little bit about that, and then about your experience and the central question of why you've written this book? It's not really about a pot history of Israel-Palestine conflict, but there is there is this feeling that you carry as a journalist about going into Palestine. And can you really talk about that?
Yeah, it's West Bank, Ramallah, basically, the administrative headquarters of the Palestinian Authority, is not a city that is easily accessible. You need an Israeli visa to go to the West Bank, and then you have to fly to Tel Aviv and then cross the checkpoint, Israeli checkpoint, and go to the West Bank. Or you can go to Jordan, Amman. So I've been to West Bank twice. First I went to Amman and then crossed the border, the Jordanian border, and then to Tel Aviv and cross the West Bank Israeli border. Even if you are entering West Bank from the Jordanian side, you will have to go through the Israeli checkpoints. And West Bank is, it's like, okay, we have read about West Bank. I had also read about West Bank. I've been studying about West Asia. I've been a student of West Asia for a long period of time. But still, what I witnessed in West Bank was entirely different, because it's like, let's say that Ramallah is the administrative capital, and Abu Dis is where Palestine's largest university is situated. If you are a student, if you want to travel from Ramallah to Abu Dis, you will have to go through multiple Israeli checkpoints. Even if you want to get out of Ramallah, and you will have to go through Israeli checkpoints. And Israeli soldiers will be there, very young soldiers holding guns. I have described one of the accounts which I encountered in the book. And you will have to convince them, why are you there? Or even if you are an Israeli. And in Ramallah, I remember, I think it was 2016, my first visit to Ramallah. And I remember talking to people from bartenders to taxi drivers to locals in the West Bank. They were telling me how difficult it is for them to leave one city for another, one township for another, because of this checkpoint system. So if you look at West Bank in total, there are 560 Israeli checkpoints are there in the West Bank. And all these townships are like capsules. It's not one occupied entity. Like it's not Algeria,
it's
the
like
French occupied
ghettos.
Algeria, because within the occupied territories you can move around. Okay, you still have a colonial ruler. But here, each township is like a capsule. If you want to move from one place to the other, you will have to go through the foreign checkpoints. So that is the situation in the West Bank. And why I wrote the book, I think the trigger point was the October 7 attack,
Yes.
of course. But my experience in the West Bank, my experience also in Israel, and I was in Israel even after the attack. The October 7 attack, I went to Israel. I was in the north, I was in the south. Of course, we didn't go to Gaza. Gaza is still not accessible for independent journalists unless you are going with Israeli troops. You can't go to Gaza, even now. So you don't have first-hand information of what's happening in Gaza. So that's one reality. So, but we went to the border. We went to the northern border also, where Hezbollah Israeli fights were going on. So the trigger was the October 7 attack, but I've been traveling in the region. I was talking to these people. So I thought, that Palestine has to be, it is back. It is back at the forefront of West Asian geopolitics today. Because if we were having this discussion, let's say in September 2023, everybody would tell you that Palestine is a non-issue. It's been pushed to the fringes of West Asia. But today, here we are.
It's the only issue.
Yeah, today here we are. Because if you want peace in West Asia today, it's been always like this, but there was a dominant narrative that Palestine doesn't matter because you have the Abraham Accords, you have the India-Middle East, the economic corridor that is connecting India via the Gulf, Israel, and Europe. You had all fancy projects, and Palestine was not at all discussed. The Emiratis normalized ties with the Israelis. The Saudis were in a very advanced stage of normalizing ties with the Israelis. But then the October 7 happens. So unless you address the Palestine issue, that's why I call it the revenge of old West Asia. Because the Palestine question is the central question of West Asia.
So do you think in some ways it is also the moral question of our times as a journalist?
It is. It is the moral question of our time because you look at the numbers. See, I try to stick to facts. Opinion, I have my opinion, of course, but still, being a journalist, you look at the numbers. 44,000 people were killed in Gaza in the last 13 months. 44,000 people. 100,000 people have been injured. 2.3 million people, the entire population of Gaza, have been turned into refugees. 2.3 million people. And Gaza has been destroyed, decimated completely. Apparently, there is not a single, in a sense, practically livable building standing in Gaza unless it is controlled by the Israeli military. So these are the facts. And Amnesty International says it's a genocide. And there is a case.
The UN is saying it's a genocide.
Yeah. And the ICJ, there is a case going on in ICJ, and ICJ, in its first ruling, asked Israel to take measures to avoid a genocide, which means the ICJ was saying Israel has genocidal intent, at least. And there is an arrest warrant against Prime Minister Netanyahu and his former defense minister at ICC, International Criminal Court. So you have this overwhelming, numbers, evidence, everything is suggesting that what's happening in Gaza is unacceptable for a civilized world. But you don't see any moral anger from the big powers of the world. Even the greatest powers of our times, who are talking about human rights all the time, do not bother about what's happening in Gaza. So it is a very critical moral question of our time. But fundamentally, Palestine, even if you look at international UN resolutions, etc., Palestine has been an occupied territory at least since 1967. So you don't have a solution to that. You don't have a Palestinian state yet. And then the war is going on, occupation is going on, and then the latest war is going on. So you look at it from any dimension, you can clearly say that this is a very important moral question, which is not being addressed adequately by the world's powerful powers.
So I'm going to ask you one more question, which is going to be a factual question, but one I'm going to ask you a philosophical question. As a journalist, and there have been many journalists that have been killed in Gaza. As a journalist, when you're reporting, and we all believe that we change the world, or at least we try and change this thing. Do you think in some ways you feel, I mean, is there a deep helplessness? Because here you are talking about things that should matter, reporting on things that should matter, and it's just black and white paper, and it doesn't really matter. So how do you deal with that?
Yeah. So while reporting, we try to detach from what's happening, but it's still very difficult when
Yeah.
you see this kind of human suffering. It's very difficult to detach from it, and it's on both sides. I was also there in Kibbutz Be'eri, for
Yeah.
example, which is the Jewish kibbutz on the Gaza border, where the Hamas had carried out the attack on October 7th. I was there. I saw burned out houses.
Yes.
I saw. I heard stories about people who were killed, civilians, and even peace activists. For example, the Canadian citizen who was there, Vivian. So I had written about her in the book. So I have seen atrocities on both sides, and as a journalist, your job, you need to show a little bit of detachment,
Yeah.
and then you need to report facts. But at the same time, these questions, I mean, the same moral questions will continue to haunt you. At the end of the day, you will ask why there is no Palestinian state. Because, why there is no, I mean, everybody supports the two-state solution. Why can't we have the two-state solution? We will ask the same question like why the United States, which is the world's most powerful country, continues to back Israel,
Yeah.
despite Israel's continued violations of all the international, all the UN Security Council resolutions when it comes to Palestine. So there are these questions that will continue to haunt you, but still what we are doing at the end of the day is to tell the people what actually happened.
Bear witness.
And you might be attacked for that.
Yeah.
Because there are opinions on both sides. Someone will call you a pro-jihadist. Someone will call you a Zionist. All kind of names would be there. But at the end of the day, you tell the people what is happening, what you saw, and you talk to people on the both sides, and then you report. I mean, like I think Don Graham said, at the end of the day, journalism or these kind of books are the first rough draft of history.
Yeah.
So, and the historians can dig in much deeper.
So we now at this point of time we've got Trump coming in, right?
Yeah.
Solve this or all hell will break loose. How do you see that changing? And can you also comment about the changes that have happened around West Asia at this point of time with Syria falling, as well as the truce with Hezbollah?
Yeah. So with regard to Trump is pro-Israel. There is no doubt about it. Because it was when Trump was the president, Israel shifted its embassy to Jerusalem. And it was Trump who recognized Israel's annexation of Syria's Golan Heights. So you don't expect anything different from Trump. But when I say Trump is going to be pro-Israel, Biden is also, there is no difference. At least when it comes to Israel-Palestine, there is no difference. And many people tell me that Trump can make it worse. So the question is that how can you make it worse than this?
Yeah.
It's already the worst, what's happening in Gaza, no? Trump can continue the status quo, that's one thing. So you don't expect any qualitative change from a Trump administration. But at the same time, there is a dichotomy. Trump is also a bundle of contradictions. Trump will remain pro-Israel, but Trump doesn't want the United States to get involved in another prolonged war in West Asia.
Yeah.
He keeps saying that. He attacks the 4-hour wars, right? So Trump doesn't want, at least on paper, if you look at his statements, interviews, etc., he doesn't want a war with Iran. So, with regard to Israel-Palestine, yes, Trump will continue to back Israel, but when it comes to the tensions between Israel and Iran, it is possible, I don't know whether it's going to happen, but it's possible that Trump might try to dial down tensions between Israel and Iran. So that is the larger regional situation we have to wait and see. And with regard to what's happening in the region, see, what Israel has been doing was that, yes, the October 7 attack was murderous. It was terrible what happened in Israel on October 7, what Hamas did. And what Israel is trying to do is to use that attack to reshape the region. So Gaza, as we saw, that is being decimated completely. And Israel also went to war with Hezbollah, right? Israel wanted to destroy Hezbollah and reshape basically the region because Iran is the primary enemy. So if you take out Hamas, if you take out Hezbollah, what you are actually doing is weakening Iran, right? So that will invariably strengthen your regional position. So this is Israel's strategic goals. Now you look at what's happening. Did Israel defeat Hamas? It hasn't. Hamas still remains. Okay, Hamas is not the same militant organization, but remains, it survives as an insurgency. Did Israel destroy Hezbollah? No, it didn't. Even on the last day of the fighting, even on the day the ceasefire was signed, Hezbollah had fired some 250 rockets from Lebanon to Israel. And Netanyahu had actually walked back on his promise. He said that he will stop the war with Hezbollah only if northern Israelis are allowed to go back to their homes. But they are still refugees. They are still displaced. But Netanyahu had to accept a ceasefire. So he hasn't. But at the same time, I would say what happened in Syria, the fall of the Bashar al-Assad regime is a major setback for the Iranians as well as the Russians, which would strengthen the hands of the Israelis and the Americans in the region.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, so now one question. We've talked about Syria, and we all see this as a far, far away space, right?
Yeah.
But there is, Assad forever, for however horrid he was.
That was the slogan.
Yeah.
Assad forever.
Yeah, right?
Yeah.
But he was essentially, he had somewhat of a pluralistic form, right? Now you've got something, and let's say we are deeply uncomfortable with the new regime that's going to take in. But can you also connect that with what happened in Afghanistan and the attack on Haqqani?
Yeah. So the mainstream narrative, if you read New York Times, Washington Post, and Wall Street Journal, etc., Syrian rebels have now freed Syria from the brutal dictatorship of Bashar al-Assad, isn't it?
Yes.
And if you read Economist is welcoming what happened in Syria. Who are these rebels? The basic question is that. That's what I try to do even in my pieces in the Hindu. Abu Muhammad al-Jolani is the leader of the rebels, right? And Abu Muhammad al-Jolani has some 10 million bounty on his head, issued by the US State Department.
Yeah.
And Jolani is the guy who established Al-Qaeda's network in Syria back in 2012. And Jolani is the guy picked by Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, who was the leader of the Islamic State back in 2012, to send him across the border from Syria to from Iraq to Syria to set up a shop. Whose shop? Al-Qaeda shop. So this is the guy who is now welcomed as a blazer-wearing revolutionary by CNN. You can go read the interview on CNN, right? So he is now, Jolani has become now a revolutionary, but he is the guy who established Al-Qaeda in Syria. And his organization, HTS, used to be called Jabhat al-Nusra. And Jabhat al-Nusra is Al-Qaeda. He changed the name just to make himself acceptable, and he became acceptable. It's as simple as that. Okay, Bashar al-Assad is bad, no doubt about it. I'm not a fan of Assad. I'm not a fan of dictators either, in general. But
some, okay.
No. My point is that you have to understand a country's history and politics in the context.
Yeah.
You can't just bring in the grand notions from the skies. And Assad, Syria is a very diverse country. It is 70% Sunni Muslims, 13% Alawites. Alawites are an offshoot of Shiaism. And the Sunni extremists in Syria, like HTS, they don't see Alawites even as Muslims. So Jolani had said that Alawites had to either convert, or they have to either become true Muslims or leave the country. That's what he thinks. And Syria also has a sizable Christian population. It has Druze, it also has Shia. And it's a very diverse country. And Syrian constitution used to be a secular constitution. Okay, Assad was a dictator. Who's not a dictator? You think the Saudi king is some liberal messiah? Or the ruler of UAE? No. So the fall of Assad will definitely have its own impact. Now everybody is celebrating HTS. We have to wait and see what happens. HTS is not the only faction. You have HTS in the north. You have SDF, Syrian Democratic Forces, in the east. You have the Southern Front in the south. Until now, they had a common enemy, Assad the tyrant, right? Now the common enemy is gone. What are they going to do? Who's going to rule Syria now? We have to wait and see this. We have three examples here. One is, of course, Afghanistan. We know that in the 1980s, especially in the 1980s, when Afghanistan was a communist country, the United States, the Saudis, and the Pakistanis were funding the Mujahideen. And the Mujahideen were the liberators, right? Ronald Reagan met the Mujahideen in the Oval Office, welcomed them, hugged them as revolutionaries. And then the Mujahideen came back to power. What happened to Afghanistan? Afghanistan still hasn't recovered from what happened to Afghanistan in the early 1990s. Even Taliban came much later, in 1994, right? And then you look at Libya.
Yeah.
And Libya again, Muammar Gaddafi was a bad guy, again another dictator.
You look at Saddam Hussein.
Saddam Hussein, that's the third example. You look at Saddam Hussein. And Libya was apparently liberated from Gaddafi by NATO. Okay, NATO. NATO is a force of liberation. And then what happened to Libya today? You have two governments in Libya, multiple militias, and then two parliaments. This country used to be the most stable country in Africa. So if you look at these examples, and Iraq, so if you look at Afghanistan, if you look at Libya, if you look at Iraq, I don't think the signs are encouraging for Syria.
Okay. And now I want to open it up because we just have 4 minutes and I know we have lots of questions. So, lady, because gender, okay, there. Lady, please. Quick questions.
Hi, my name is Bansri. Since we're sitting in India, I was wondering if you can comment on sort of India's pivot in West Asia and particularly with the Israel-Palestine conflict and how India's sort of in the last decade that we're seeing.
Should we take this as a question too and then we can answer what?
Yeah.
So India has earlier supported the Palestinian cause, but it has shifted, maybe because of the change in the government. But my question is, why is it becoming a sin to support the Palestinian cause?
So both are basically similar questions. I'll answer this. So there is one chapter in the book about India's position, the view from India. So which I have detailed India's the evolution. Basically, both the continuity as well as the changes in India's position with regard to Israel-Palestine in that chapter. I'll say this. So one is that India's position, India's policy towards Israel has evolved. India's policy towards Palestine has also evolved. But India hasn't given up the Palestine cause entirely. India hasn't given. There is a narrative that India has completely pivoted away. India hasn't completely pivoted away. I'll tell you how India's position has evolved. India used to be a strong champion of the Palestinian cause, which India is not anymore. Okay? During the Cold War, we were a strong champion of the Palestine cause. And in the post-Cold War era, let's say from 1991 to 2015, you know why 2015 matters, right? 2015, India's position was that India supports the creation of an independent, sovereign Palestinian state based on the 1967 border, with East Jerusalem being its capital. This is the position Indian President Pranab Mukherjee repeated when he was in Palestine. He was in Ramallah, Tel Aviv, and Jordan in 2015. I reported his visit back in 2015. But from 2015 onwards, India's position changes that India supports the Palestinian cause. That's it. So we don't talk about the border anymore. We don't talk about the refugees anymore. We don't talk about the capital anymore. And this period, we also saw that India's relationship with Israel has basically improving a lot. Like now it has strategic dimension, military dimension, technological cooperation. I would say it also has an ideological dimension at this point of time. So India's relationship with Israel has evolved. Along with that, India's position towards Palestine has also diluted. But at the same time, see, Israel is not the only pillar of India's West Asia policy. India's West Asia policy traditionally has three pillars. One is Israel, and the other is the Arab world, and third is Iran. And it is essential, if you want to be a great power, want to be a major power, if you want to be a respectable power in the global south, it is imperative, irrespective of who the government is in Delhi, to maintain a balance between these three pillars. Right? That is the sensible foreign policy choice. Now, if you look at India's voting record since October 7, there were 6 major voting at UN Security Council, UN General Assembly. So in the first vote, India abstained. That called for a ceasefire. And then in 4 subsequent votes, India voted in favor of those resolutions. So India voted against Israel's continuing settlements in the West Bank. India voted endorsing India's support for Palestinian self-determination. India voted against Israel's continuing occupation of Syria's Golan Heights. And then India voted in favor of a ceasefire in Gaza. So it's a bit complex position, but what you will see is that India continues to balance between these 3 pillars, but you can see a tilt towards Israel.
Yeah. Well, we have 34 seconds, so if it's a one-word answer. Question? Yes.
Yeah, it's not much of a geopolitical or an ideological question. Why, in essence, are you tilted towards West Asia and captivated by it? We as Indians live alienated to this existence of West Asia. For you personally, why are you captivated and attracted towards it since a very long time? I follow you since a very long
West Asia is India's extended neighborhood. We are dependent on West Asia for oil. We have very good historical, cultural ties with West Asia. Millions of Indians are living in the Gulf for their livelihood. So whatever is happening in West Asia will affect you. Right from 1947, West Asia has attained a critical space in India's foreign policy, and it will continue to be there. And West Asia has also been a key theater for great power politics. The Americans were there, the Soviets were there, now the Russians are there, the Americans are still there, the Chinese are going to be there in West Asia. So India is not going to be focused only on its borders. India, especially when India is rising, its economic profile is rising, its geopolitical profile is rising, its interest in West Asia is only going to be enhanced. It's as simple as that.